Hello. In this series I'm going to explore the building of England's cathedrals of the High Middle Ages, from the Norman Conquest to the Reformation, so from the late 11th century to around 1540. Buildings rooted in our landscape and history that were the soaring, awe-inspiring wonders of their age and that continue to uplift and amaze us today. In the decades after the Conquest, the Normans initiated a massive church building programme. We've seen nothing on the same scale since. Far more was invested in England after the Conquest than in Normandy. England was rich, money was in the hands of a few, and labour was cheap and plentiful. I think partly the motivation was a sweeping away of the Anglo-Saxon past, a spiritual as well as a physical takeover, replacing modest buildings with grander edifices, leaving a highly visible reminder in the landscape. And, in a deeply religious age, after the brutality of the Conquest and possibly the fear of eternal damnation looming, I believe there was also an element of atonement, of penance. Around 6,000 churches were built or rebuilt larger and grander, including the Anglo-Saxon minsters we might see as cathedral forerunners, such as at Winchester, and there were new foundations. Norman Winchester, Norwich and Durham were relatively spare and plain inside. Others were colourful, plastered, painted and richly decorated, spectacular theatres for worship, an attempt to recreate heaven on earth. The Anglo-Saxon religious centres inherited by the Normans were often in remote places. Under the Normans, bishoprics were moved to more central urban locations. A synod held in London by Archbishop Lanfranc, this is his sculpture at Canterbury Cathedral, in 1075 decreed that bishops should have their seat in the principal town of their diocese. A bishopric based at Selsey moved to Chichester, Dorchester-on-Thames transferred to Lincoln, and Elmham to Norwich via a brief stay in Thetford. Moves that reflected continental practice, enhanced the importance of the bishop, and also in order to better ensure the bishop's safety. The term cathedral refers to the seat of a bishop and derives from the Greek word for chair, cathedra. This is the bishop's chair, or more properly throne, in Exeter Cathedral. By the early 12th century, there were perhaps a dozen cathedrals in the world to rival the splendour of St. Peter's in Rome. Most of those were in England. Administratively, the church was divided into sees or dioceses. For most of our period, the High Middle Ages, there were 19 sees in England, 19 cathedrals and 17 bishops, with Bath and Wells and Coventry and Lichfield combined under a single bishop. More have been created since, beginning with Bristol, Chester, Gloucester, Oxford and Peterborough following the Reformation. The country was essentially two interlocking states, a lay state headed by the king and a religious state that stretched over much of Europe, ruled by the Pope, represented in England by the senior bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Before the Reformation, who had the right to nominate the Archbishop of Canterbury, the cathedral chapter, the Pope or the monarch caused more than the occasional problem. The two wealthiest and most powerful people in medieval England were the monarch and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Almost a third of the richest dioceses in late medieval Europe were in England. Money is a vital factor in our story. Without it, the great cathedrals would not have been built. The church in England owned vast swathes of land and also attracted donations, legacies and endowments from wealthy patrons, and sales of indulgences might swell the coffers. England's medieval cathedrals were largely built with personal money, with most of the funding contributed by the bishop and the chapter from their income. We might see them almost as vanity projects, a way of leaving a lasting legacy. Our medieval cathedrals operated on two very different models. The cathedrals of Bath, now Bath Abbey with the diocese consolidated at Wells, Canterbury, Carlisle, Coventry, Durham, Ely, Norwich, Rochester, Winchester and Worcester operated a monastic model, with a bishop in the role of abbot and monks under a prior leading a communal life of prayer, poverty, celibacy and seclusion. Others functioned on a secular model, churchmen who were part of the wider community, not bound by a religious rule. They might be part of a loose collegiate community of priests or canons, forming a chapter to assist with spiritual duties, but they often lived alone, owned property, and until well into the 12th century tended to ignore the church's code of celibacy. They frequently married and had families. This collegiate church model operated at Lichfield, Chichester, Exeter, Hereford, Lincoln, Old St Paul's, Salisbury, Wells and York. We might call these secular cathedrals. You can see a tension between the two models, one inward looking, based on exclusion from the world outside, the other outward looking, engaging with the world, one idealist, the other more practical, one predominantly spiritual, the other pastoral. This tension showed in church politics and was reflected in church architecture. Cathedrals required living quarters for their associated community. Secular churchmen needed their own individual houses. Monastic cathedrals required dormitories and refectories and a range of charitable buildings, places for travellers to stay and for people to seek medical help. The great showpiece west fronts at Wells and Lichfield reflect secular engagement with the outside world. Every cathedral has its own individual character, but that said, there are shared common grand church design features, and I shall consider those next time. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe buttons and click on the notification bell to be informed when the next video is available, or you can subscribe by clicking on the rose window over my shoulder.